The Civil War was a storm that swept through the nation, uprooting lives and reshaping the land. For the soldiers who fought in it, the battlefield was more than a place of combat. It was a crucible where the limits of endurance, courage, and humanity were tested daily. The harrowing experience of life on the battlefield was defined not just by the clash of muskets and the roar of cannons, but by the relentless grind of hunger, fear, and the longing for home. James Carter was 18 years old when he enlisted in the Union Army. A farm boy from Pennsylvania, he had grown up hearing stories of valor and duty. The war, at first, seemed like a grand adventure, a chance to escape the monotony of the fields and make his mark on history. But the reality was far from the glory he had imagined. The moment James arrived at the training camp, he was struck by the chaos. Hundreds of young men like him, untested and wide-eyed, struggled to adjust to the harsh discipline of military life. The uniforms were ill-fitting, the food was scarce, and the training was grueling. Yet, amidst the discomfort, there was a sense of camaraderie, a fragile bond forged in the shared hope that they might survive whatever lay ahead. The first time James saw a battlefield, it was as if he had stepped into a nightmare. The rolling hills and quiet forests he had known all his life were now replaced with churned earth, shattered trees, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of muskets firing in unison was deafening. He remembered gripping his rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his heart pounding as the command to advance echoed down the line. When the fighting began, it was chaos. James had been taught the mechanics of loading and firing his musket, but nothing could prepare him for the sheer terror of standing in a line exposed, while enemy bullets whizzed past him. The first man to fall was a boy no older than himself, shot clean through the chest. James froze, staring at the lifeless body, until a sharp yell from his sergeant snapped him back to reality. He fired his weapon, though he didn't know if he hit anything. His hand shook, his ears rang, and all around him men shouted, cursed, and screamed in pain. The battle lasted hours, though it felt like days. When it was over, the once green field was littered with bodies. James stumbled through the carnage, searching for familiar faces. Some of his comrades were dead, others moaned in agony, clutching wounds that bled freely. The battlefield smelled of blood and smoke, a stench that would haunt James for the rest of his life. But the battle was only the beginning. Life on the battlefield was a constant struggle against not only the enemy, but also the elements, disease, and exhaustion. Camps were hastily constructed, with soldiers sleeping on the bare ground or, if they were lucky, under tattered tents. The food was barely edible. Hardtack biscuits so tough they had to be soaked in water to avoid breaking teeth, and salt pork that was often rancid. James learned to ration his meals, trading whatever he could for an extra piece of bread or a cup of coffee. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, a dull ache that never truly went away. Then there was the cold. Winter was merciless, especially for soldiers without proper clothing or shelter. James remembered one bitter night when the wind howled through the camp, slicing through his thin woolen coat like a knife. He huddled with his comrades for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Many didn't survive those nights. Disease and frostbite claimed as many lives as the enemy's bullets. The specter of death was ever present, a constant companion. Disease ran rampant in the camps, spreading quickly through the ranks. Dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox were as deadly as any musket ball. James watched helplessly, as friends he had marched with fell ill and wasted away. The army's doctors, often ill-equipped and overwhelmed, did their best, but there was little they could do for the gravely sick. Amputations were common, performed without anesthesia, the screams of the wounded echoing through the camp. Despite the horrors, moments of humanity persisted. Letters from home were cherished treasures, read and reread by the light of a flickering campfire. James carried a crumpled letter from his mother, her words a lifeline that tethered him to a world beyond the war. He also found solace in his comrades. They shared stories, sang songs, and dreamed of the lives they would lead when the war was over. For a few fleeting moments, they could forget the battlefield and remember who they were before the war had consumed them. But the war changed them all. James was no longer the naive farm boy who had enlisted with dreams of glory. He had seen too much, felt too much, to ever return to that innocence. Each battle left scars, both physical and emotional. He had lost friends, men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him, their laughter now a ghostly memory. By the time the war ended, James had survived more than he thought possible. He returned home to Pennsylvania, his uniform tattered and his spirit weary. The farm was the same, but he was not. The war had left its mark, a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. At night, he often dreamed of the battlefield, the smoke, the cries, the faces of those he had lost. But in those dreams, he also remembered the moments of bravery, the bonds of friendship, and the resilience that had seen him through. Life on the battlefield had been harrowing, a relentless test of endurance and humanity. But James carried the hope that his sacrifices, and those of his comrades, had not been in vain, that their struggle had paved the way for a better future. In the quiet of his farm, as he watched the sun rise over the fields, he found solace in the knowledge that he had survived, and in doing so, honored the memories of those who had not. James returned to the farm, but it no longer felt like the sanctuary it once had been. The land was the same, its rolling hills and vast fields stretching toward the horizon, but he viewed it with a different lens now, one forged by the horrors of war. The barn he had once worked in alongside his father seemed smaller, quieter, almost too peaceful for his restless mind. He found it hard to adjust to a world that no longer demanded he wake up to the sound of drums or sleep under the looming threat of gunfire. His family welcomed him with open arms, but they quickly realized that the boy who had left them was not the man who returned. James carried an invisible weight, a burden that could not be shed with a warm meal or a good night's rest. He smiled when his mother fussed over him, but the smile never reached his eyes. His younger siblings, eager to hear tales of the war, soon learned not to ask. James would simply shake his head and change the subject. The nights were the hardest. Sleep eluded him, stolen by the memories that surged forward the moment he closed his eyes. He would see the faces of the men who had fought beside him, some smiling, others frozen in their final moments of agony. The sounds of battle, the crack of muskets, the cries of the wounded, the relentless pounding of cannon fire, echoed in his ears, refusing to fade. He often found himself standing by the window in the dead of night, staring out at the fields bathed in moonlight, longing for a peace that seemed just out of reach. The community, too, had changed. While James had been away, the war had touched even those who hadn't seen combat. Families had lost sons, fathers, and brothers. The once lively church pews were now filled with grieving faces, and the local cemetery had grown noticeably larger. Though many were eager to rebuild and move forward, the scars of the conflict were evident in every corner of the town. One day, as James worked the fields alongside his father, he paused to watch the wind ripple through the crops. The sight reminded him of the open plains he had marched across during the war, where the wind carried not the promise of a harvest, but the dread of an enemy ambush. His father, sensing his distraction, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're home now, son," he said softly. "The war's behind you." But was it? James often questioned whether the war was something that could ever truly be left behind. The battles might have ended, but the conflict raged on in his mind. He began to wonder if the only way to find peace was to confront the memories, rather than bury them. In the months that followed, James found small ways to reconnect with life. He threw himself into the work of the farm, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of planting and harvesting. The physical labor, though grueling, grounded him, giving his restless hands a purpose. He also began attending church again, not so much for the sermons, but for the quiet comfort of sitting among his neighbors, united in their shared grief and hope. One autumn evening, James ventured into town for a meeting of local veterans. The group had been formed by others like him, men who had returned from the war carrying wounds both visible and unseen. At first, James was reluctant to speak, but as he listened to their stories, so similar to his own, he began to feel a sense of belonging. These men understood what he had endured, and for the first time, he didn't feel so alone. Slowly, he started to share his experiences. He spoke of the friends he had lost, the battles that had tested his courage, and the nights when he had doubted he would live to see another sunrise. The words came haltingly at first, but with each meeting, the weight on his chest seemed to lighten. He realized that by telling his story, he was not only honoring the memories of those who had fallen, but also finding a way to heal. One day, as James walked through the village, he noticed a group of children playing in the field. Their laughter was pure, untainted by the darkness he had known. It struck him that these children, so full of life, were the very reason he and his comrades had fought. They were the promise of a better future, one free from the shadows of war. For the first time in years, James felt a glimmer of hope. He began to write letters to the families of the men he had served with, sharing stories of their bravery and sacrifice. It was a painful task, but he felt it was important to ensure that their lives were remembered, not just for how they had died, but for how they had lived. Some families wrote back, thanking him for his kindness, while others remained silent, their grief too profound for words. As the seasons turned, James continued to rebuild his life. He married a local girl, Mary, who had lost her brother in the war. Together, they found comfort in each other's presence, a shared understanding of loss that deepened their bond. They worked the farm side by side, raising children who grew up hearing stories of courage and resilience, but also of the importance of peace. Years later, James would sit on his porch, watching his grandchildren play in the fields. The sight filled him with a quiet pride, knowing that he had done his part to ensure their future. The memories of the war never completely faded. They were a part of him, etched into his soul, but they no longer consumed him. He had found a way to carry them without being weighed down, to honor the past while embracing the present. In the end, James understood that life on the battlefield had shaped him, but it did not define him. The lessons he had learned, the value of courage, the strength found in unity, and the enduring power of hope, became the foundation on which he built the rest of his life. The battlefield was behind him, but the life he fought for stretched endlessly ahead, filled with the promise of new beginnings.